Good evening, it's February 27th, 2024. This is the meeting of the 2229 Main Street Advisory Task Force. I'm Chair Paul Baldwin, and first order of business will be calling the roll. Kurt Herman. Here. Gary Clement. Here. Rick Keeley. Here. Ruffy. Here. Simon. Here. And Bill. Here. Paul Baldwin, I'm here. I know that the court has a conflict with school community. Great, welcome here. So first, we have a pretty full agenda, and I did something different with this agenda. Just so pace ourselves. So I think we'll have enough time to discuss the various items. And I think this is kind of a catch-up meeting with various things going on. Streams going on, what Rue has talked to us about, and some upcoming meetings this week. So we'll get on all those topics. First order is minutes. Has anybody had a chance to look at those minutes? Put them up on the screen.
Except physically present, isn't that the online meeting?
No. This time is not. Physically present is which is in person. Designation.
Avatars don't count.
I was trying to figure out, that was, you sent us an email. Isn't that right?
It was a Zoom meeting, yes, with Zoom that didn't.
It didn't have, never.
Anyway, any
sessions.
Nothing else in the
comments
minutes.
on the minutes? Motion to
Usual breakdown. So moved.
Kurt?
Aye.
David? Aye. Allison, thank you. Thank you, Richard, again. Excellent minutes. Ready to see you. Hand raised. Is that in the third tower? Your question about communications? Okay. No answer. Okay, so first thing I want to talk about just very briefly, there was a site meeting today that several of us had in the spring day site. Just my reaction reflections, they're making really good progress site, and I find the briefings really helpful. You know, there are always twists and turns and changes, and Bruce is very, very helpful explaining those. And yeah, they can do more investigative work than we had anticipated, so it's going to be expensive, but to fully characterize.
Excuse me, Paul, the sound is not really, it's like breaking, it's coming in and out.
Is that me or the owl?
That's
Move
better. You're much better
Move the
now.
owl down towards Paul.
Okay, we're moving the owl. I'm gonna hoot now. Is that a little better, Terry?
Much better, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We had to reposition it. I just was saying the site visit was very instructive. Lots of good progress. I learned a couple of things. I learned a new acronym. It's called SWARU, SWARU, SWARU. Have you ever heard of that?
Not until this morning.
Yeah, so a SWARU is the site ready for
Site-wide, SW, site-wide.
Site-wide, anyway, it's a reuse. It's basically a determination by EPA in a document that's put out that tells the owner that the site is
Area
ready
ready
for
for
use.
use.
I hadn't realized that I should have, that there's a specific document which EPA tells the owner the site's ready. That, according to Kara, that's anticipated to happen right now at the end of 2027. I'm not sure if that'll happen at that date, but that's kind of the timing. So that was one interesting tidbit. The other piece, we had talked about potentially influencing the remediation in terms of grading and what we want to do. It turns out that with the activities at the site, the focus of this upcoming year is going to be on the holding basin, the cap, injection of lots of zero valent ions, iron to take care of the holding basin, and then investigations on the soils. The final grading determinations are a year or two out. So as far as any input that we might have into the sort of final use and grading, it's well beyond the point that the select board has to make a decision. And I anticipate if they make a decision to acquire, it'll be in the planning period. We'll be in a much better position to influence, the gradings substantively, because we can't do that now. So that was a little bit of a relief to me, because I think we've all been talking about, gee, we need to figure out how to help EPA, and I think we have time on that. So I don't know if anybody else has any other quick reflections. It wasn't on the agenda, but it happened this morning, so.
I guess the only other thing is that, we're going beyond 250 million. Or the collective cost will go beyond 250.
Yeah, and that includes work that's done from the eighties. It's
Yeah,
not
right.
just a Superfund cost. So that's a collective cost to clean up the site, which is substantial.
I would just underscore how reactive he was in a positive sense to questions for clarification, responding to comments. I was trying to pick up who some of the voices might have been. Several of them, I think, were Pam. But that there seems to be a very sincere recognition of the interests of the community that lives around this site, and I liked that. Having been there once for the on-site tour was it June, early June,
Yeah.
that we were there. And trying to remember what we had seen, what we had, because there we had the opportunity to walk around. Some of that site is familiar to me in other ways, but I'm impressed
Yeah.
with the information that they are willing to share and explain details like what the, SWARU means. Because, they'll just flow off their.
Yeah, it was very interesting. I asked questions with regards to timing, because I want to know how the pieces are gonna fit. The other timing piece I asked is, there's 5-year, what's the term? 5-year investigations, and this
Yeah.
5-year look at the remediation. So the clock on that probably starts at the beginning of 2028.
Mhm.
So, and so there'll be new sets of data for a long time, because the site is not gonna be closed per se for remediation for quite some time, because it'll still be pumping depleted uranium. So anyway, that's an update that very good, and site looks good. So let's move
Pam
into.
has a comment as well.
So,
Yeah.
what you said about it being taken off the national priority list, the sites that Carrie and I were looking at for the task force, those come off the priorities list even while a pump and treat system, even while there are still 5-year infinitely 5-year
Right.
follow-up plans to make sure that landfills and remedies are still working. So
And
that-
one of the things he mentioned was the annual mowing, even if it's a pollinator field on top of the cap, that you would mow it so that you don't have trees growing roots and possibly permeating, that there's still things that are watched and monitored, and obligations for whomever is responsible.
And
at
that can
point.
happen after it's delisted.
Right.
Right. But that doesn't mean that it necessarily would be delisted as soon as.
Yeah, sometimes it takes a long time to delist.
The other thing that they mentioned was that they are still looking for soil to do fill with and make decisions about that.
Mhm.
So if we were to have a use for that wooded area right up along Main Street and wanted to put housing there, that is a very good source of clean soil for them. If we ever wanted to flatten that, we could have them flatten it.
Yeah, they don't know how much soil they're gonna need, because it depends how much, the large area right in the middle of the site that is where the slabs are, when they remove that, they anticipate a lot of soil. I mean, they could, I think the original plan was maybe 80,000 cubic yards, now it could be 100,000 cubic yards. So anyway, this in the future and so I just, yes,
There
David.
was one thing I heard this morning that I thought would be important in our recommendations to the select board, which was the timing, you mentioned it, the delisting, that the EPA says you're ready to go with your SWARU and all of that before it's off the list. So when people ask that, or we need to clarify that as a step, if we recommend acquisition, we don't have to wait until it's delisted for the acquisition and use and so forth to start up. The timing of those things is worth letting the select board know about, I think.
It's just overlapped.
Well, one can come before the other. We don't have to wait until it's off the Superfund list before we can go ahead with doing stuff.
Right.
There are lots of timing issues that are gonna have to be clarified in the future, but just, you know, I think we'll learn more. But it does, I think when we write our report, if the select board, it's one of our if you acquire it, here's the anticipated timing, this is what's gonna happen over the next few years. I want to talk about the whole timing issue of decision-making, so that at one of our next meetings, we'll talk about that later. So, okay, let's move on. Several of us attended a presentation where we asked Rue to kind of clarify the methodology, how they were doing their risk assessment, and they did, and I asked Kurt to give us an overview of that PowerPoint. I'll put that up here. And I'll share. Share. Okay. Yeah, you want to give us a?
Yeah, sure.
I'll flip through the slides just to change.
Okay, so we spoke with them about 2 weeks ago. And again, the intent was to understand a little bit more about their methodology, because they're slated to have results in a couple weeks. We wanted to make sure we're kind of aligned on the method they're using to evaluate exposures and also risks at the site, just to make sure we don't have a gap. And obviously it feeds in pretty significantly to the reuse scenarios. So I can kind of walk through the slides that they had presented to us, and then if there are questions, we'll try to answer them. If we don't know the answers, we can pose them to Rue. And if they need to shift on something with their methodology, there's still time, but I think they're pretty far along with the risk calculations. I think their target date was March 7th to have preliminary results.
Yeah.
So figure within 2 weeks, we'll at least get a first cut of what the post remediation risk assessment looks like. The first step is really looking at the different exposure areas. And it's kind of tricky because you're dealing with a few things. You have the 2013 baseline human health risk assessment, which evaluated pre-remediation risks and looked at a lot of very distinct exposure areas, pretty detailed. And then obviously in 2021, we have the reuse areas. And so Rue, in terms of defining their exposure areas, also factored in the sequencing of the planned remediation. And so it kind of, the next few slides kind of walk through those different depictions of exposure areas. So this is 2013, what Haley and Aldrich was doing in the baseline human health risk assessment, which again is pretty detailed. And I think the exposure areas are narrower than we're looking to rely on at this point. And I won't get into details here because I don't think it really matters a whole lot for our purposes right now. But the reason, and what Rue has done is simplify this further for purposes of exposure assessment. So that they're looking at, it's hard to read, but everything on the left, the western side, is zone 1A. So they've grouped together. I think it's, if you flip back to the previous slide, it's A1, A2, and A3. Excuse me, A2, A3, and A4 as one exposure area based on.
So they're here.
Yes, based on anticipated exposures. They're assuming future residential exposure and construction worker exposure. And also based on the timing of the remediation, because there's actual post-remediation data they can use. They separated the central area of the site, which I think they're calling zone 1B.
Yeah.
Which is really the footprint of the former facility, which has data gaps still and won't be remediated until a later date. So it's still the same exposure assumptions, residential use, construction worker, but from a data standpoint, they wanted to separate it. And if you look at the outline, it still lines up with the conceptual reuse areas from the 2021 report. It's just not color coded quite the same way. And then for the eastern portion of the site, they're calling areas 4 and 5. It's still an assumption of, oh wait, sorry, I'm reading it wrong. It's area 2, sorry. Area 2 on the far east of the site. They're also assuming residential construction workers for future use. And then area 3, which is the holding basin, trespasser, and area 4 and 5, they're calling abutting resident. And what that means is that residents who live at the site would also go to those areas of the site, the bog and the cooling basin, and have different kinds of exposure. So it's a pretty conservative assumption about the use of the site going into it.
Yeah, I was curious, why not a receptor, a full-time employee working at the site? Because, you know, we are looking at uses like town facilities where there would be people working there.
They could include that, but they're approaching it, my understanding is from a more conservative assumption about exposure. So a resident who lives there 30 years is gonna have higher exposures than a worker who's there for
Right,
fewer years and not as intensive.
right, yeah,
I think the assumption for a resident is like 350 days a year they're at the site,
yeah.
as opposed to someone who works there, which is
Right.
like 200
Yeah,
days.
But I'm just thinking about our audiences for the risk assessment. You know, if there might be employees, people, you know, if, I guess if you find absolutely no health risk for a resident, then you could say, well, there wouldn't be a health risk, but if you do find some health risk for a resident, then you have this intermediate.
Yep.
So you may
User.
wanna go back later.
And so, and given that there is potential interest on uses that would have an employee that might be on the site, I don't know, 30, 40 hours a week or
Right.
something.
What you're saying is it could be a middle category between
Right.
resident and construction worker, yeah.
Yeah, a full-time employee, because construction workers' exposure is gonna be
Yeah.
less than
I think the reason
full-time
for
worker.
including a construction worker versus a resident typically doesn't do much digging. It's
Right.
typically 2 to 3
Right.
feet.
You're digging.
Every once in a while, you
Right.
do something.
Right,
But a construction worker, it's less frequent, but it's more intense, and
right,
it's
yeah.
more direct
No,
contact.
Yeah,
And-
if they could add a middle one for a full-time
Yeah.
employee, I think it might be helpful for future communication to the public.
Do they actually make the assumption that you work from home when you're a resident?
I don't think,
They did on the risk assessment that was done by DEP for this.
I think it's just an assumption that a person is home for 300 days a year, give or take, 350.
So I think it's a very conservative approach, because I asked the question, so area 2 is the conservation area, right? So, and I look at what they're doing as sort of resident and construction worker, and I said, well, nobody's ever gonna live there. And they said, well, you know, the trespasser is the hiker, that's gonna be, you know, it's a conservative approach, so we have that covered. You could actually have put that under the trespasser category, but I think they were trying to be as conservative as they could here. And area 3, which is a holding basin, has trespasser. You can walk on that, there'll be a pollinator field, but, you know, it's gonna be very short duration, so I think there's a thoughtful selection of,
And in terms of presenting results, I think what we can do is they don't have to calculate the risk for all the intermediate
Mhm.
steps, but they can say if it's safe for a resident,
Mhm.
then it's also safe
Yeah,
for these
That's the
use.
message.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
yeah,
So kind of getting
yeah,
to results presentation.
Okay,
And this is kind of the breakdown of the different exposure pathways for a residential exposure. So this is for a resident living at the site, they're exposed to soil in different ways, sediment in certain parts of the site in different ways, to the peat, surface water and groundwater. And these are pretty conservative assumptions. We talked a little bit about assuming the swimming in the bog, which
yeah, I said swimming.
yeah.
which is pretty far-fetched, but it's being included just to be conservative.
I think that was, so there could be incidental water exposure, I mean, if you're walking around the bog, you could get knee deep in water.
Do you think
flood.
they're talking about area 4 rather than the bog?
For,
Surface water, like the only surface water is in area 4, where the drainage basin is, not where the bog is.
I think they said there could be certain, you know, in certain stages that, you know, there could be, the bog could flood. So they'd be,
The bog has a lot of water in it.
Yeah, it's a lot of water.
25 feet deep of water under that mat.
Yeah.
You can fall in and drown.
Mhm.
you don't want to go in there, but you could fall in there. You wouldn't swim.
Yeah.
Anyway, again, it's a conservative assumption because
Flying
swimmers
around
are gonna
all
be
the time, right?
exposed for longer periods of
Not too
time.
many swimmers, but they're including it.
So,
Couple other just observations. They're including soil from 0 to 10 feet, assuming that some deep soil could come up to the surface and someone could be exposed to it. They're assuming some growing of produce and ingestion of that produce and some exposure related to that. No groundwater ingestion because of the restriction on that, the potential for vapor intrusion. And then they're also including just different exposure pathways, including from radiation. That's what's referred to as the external dose. It's not a contact related dose, it's the energy from the radiation. So again, overall conservative in terms of what they're including.
yeah, this is a fun chart. Can you explain this?
So this is what they're using as kind of a framework to determine what conditions will exist after redevelopment. That's the equals on the right.
This is at the time, it's what's gonna look like at development.
At development. So it's a combination of starting with the 2013 baseline data set and taking away all the data that no longer exists or is representative of conditions because of remediation or other changes to the site. And then it's adding in all the new data that's collected as well as the post-remediation cleanup goals to represent what conditions are in the future. And then for groundwater and surface water, it's just the most recent data. And they've been working very closely with Haley and the other consultants
Yeah.
at the site to really understand the data. And it's taken them a few months to get their arms around it. And I think they're pretty far along in terms of
The
that.
way it's explained to me, I thought it was like rolling out dough, right?
Yeah.
And you take a cookie cutter and you take out certain pieces and you see what dough is left. And those pieces are, you know, what's remediated and what are you left with? There are areas of the site that aren't gonna be dug up. There are not a lot of them. And so the reliance on 2013 data will be, you know, that'll be the data they can use from sites that are not remediated, for example. So there'll be no subtractions or additions. So the left circle will equal the right circle in those areas that aren't gonna be remediated. There are not a lot of them.
Like area
A2 on the hill,
Yeah.
for example. So, so they're gonna end up with what we were hoping, that, you know. And, you know, we talked about, you know, there are assumptions here, of course, there are assumptions that the remediation is going to be completed and the remediation goals are gonna be met, and so, we had, there's also sort of assumptions here, let's get to that, and we may have a little discussion about that. This is just the data that they have to date.
Yeah, that's just kind of a status point as of 2 weeks ago. And in terms of what risk threshold they're using 10 to the -5 incremental cancer risk threshold, which is consistent with state and federal guidance. So that's for cumulative risks. Not to get too much in the weeds, but the actual cleanup goals for individual compounds were developed based on a 10 to the -6 incremental cancer risk.
That's why, yeah.
But the cumulative risk, they're using 10 to the
That's
-5.
fine. Huh.
One issue that we're gonna come across in terms of communication is that some of the risks at the site are from background conditions, so from arsenic, uranium and thorium that are present naturally occurring. And in the baseline human health risk assessment, they actually had excess risk because of that. So they needed to do 2 different risk assessments, one kind of taking out the incremental background and one including it. So just previewing, that's gonna be a little bit of a complicated issue to explain to people that, you know, they have elevated risks just from the soil and bedrock that's around them.
Mhm.
And it exceeds some of the target risk ranges that DEP and EPA have.
Let me interject very quickly in terms of communication. psychologically, people are much more upset by risks that are imposed on than that are naturally occurring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that difference is gonna matter psychologically in the message. And is an opportunity to say, well, the uranium's in the rock that was there before nuclear metals was there. You can frame it those sorts of ways very honestly, when we do the message.
And I think the reliance on cumulative risk assessment is really appropriate. That's how EPA is recommending doing that. It's not just one chemical, it's all the chemicals combined, and I think that's the right way of doing this.
So is it cumulative over time too? Is it? Like if I'm a resident, I'm living there.
Yeah,
It's
I'm
cumulative over
exposed
time,
for
it's
how
cumulative
many
over
years?
different pathways, it's
Yeah.
cumulative over different chemicals, so there's a lot of
yeah,
conservatism that's packed in there.
And the residential standard is, based on occupancy for an extended period of
Yeah.
time and hours a day. And so there's cumulative kind of built into the creation of that
Yeah.
baseline number.
And here we're just spelling out some of the key uncertainties or assumptions that Rue is factoring in. Some are pretty straightforward. They're assuming the remediation goals we met to 10 feet below ground surface. It's an important one, but it's,
yeah, we had a discussion on that, because I think how do we put some the meaning behind that assumption that the remediation is gonna be carried out? Yeah, because here we are asking the select board to make a decision in 2024/5, but we're projecting that things will be great in 2028. So, I think a combination of Rue's knowledge of the site, Pam's committee monitoring remediation, knowing that they're making progress here, we're gonna have to kind of put that together to some narrative that just doesn't say we assume this, but put some meat behind it, and what kind of proof statements we have. There are gonna be a few areas on the site that will have been remediated. Area A, for example, building A is almost completely, dug up, and so we know that they're meeting the goals there, or will be meeting the goals there by the time we write the report. So, there'll be some exemplar areas that we can say, yeah, here's an example of how those goals are being met. I think we're gonna have to talk this through as we kind of write our assumption section here, but that was one of the things I think Rue is gonna have to help us on. Yeah, how do we assure the reader that those goals can be met?
yeah.
Well, I might understand the SWARU to mean that we've checked to make sure everything's been done
Yeah.
before we sign that.
Yeah,
So there's a process for that.
well, but we won't have that by the time the select board has to.
So we can recommend that you don't act until, or you act contingent upon, or, lots of wording.
Well, this is a timing question, which we should discuss at another meeting. I mean, the select board probably will say, wow, great report, but don't we have to wait until we have the SWARU to do to start the process? We have to talk that through, the pros and cons of waiting. That's gonna be a lengthy discussion for us, but I don't think they can wait till there's a SWARU to make a decision. That's my opinion, but
Mhm.
we have to talk that through.
One of the things we've talked about with Rue is just having clearly articulated verification steps, what things need to be verified in the future to ensure that their assumptions were accurate. So, a third party could come in 5 or 10 years and say, okay, here are the things that we would need to check off just to make sure and independently verify that it has been done to meet the conditions that are protected.
So you're saying the first one would be that indeed they remove soil down to 10 feet and
Yep.
put clean soil.
And put clean backfill in, and that's the cleanup goal. So I think most of these fall into that category. Some of them just don't quite, because, they're like the fourth bullet, for example, it's based on knowledge of the site at the time and different values that go into the risk assessment, tox values and exposure assumptions, and those are updated by EPA on a routine basis. So, something could change in understanding of the toxicity of one of the chemicals. Arsenic, for example, 10 years ago had a pretty significant change, and it's a cancer slope factor, and there's some talk about that changing again.
Okay, no, thank you. We can come back to this. I think there's a very useful discussion. Of course, the interface between this activity and the reuse part, I think is pretty clear, and the interface of those two with our whole decision-making process is pretty clear, so it's important. Their timing is right here. So one thing we did discuss sort of, if you look at the last one, it says, presentation of the select board. We have presentations of the select board. We have to coordinate here with them how and when this is done. Is this a separate presentation just on the risk? Is it a combined presentation? We have to, because you know, and I have to consult with Terry on this. I think a briefing just on the risk assessment without a larger context may not be,
Would be terrible.
it will be, the context is important.
Yeah.
So-
absolutely.
That's
We suggested that to ruin the conversation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so we have to figure out how we're gonna do that and what's,
Why don't they present to us and then we present the risk assessment in the context
Yeah.
of.
That's kind of what was proposed. They just said select board because that was their thinking, and we added the filter of us.
well, that's in the scope of work, so we will have to,
Yeah,
I
okay.
think, within the next month or two, and we'll talk about our schedule of when we want to brief the select board. I think we have to jive that pretty clearly, but, so I think we're in agreement that that the standalone risk assessment thing, although informative, would raise more questions than have answers to.
You know, my impression is that Rue's on track. They have a thoughtful approach. They're incorporating conservative assumptions that aren't completely unrealistic, but still will protect the town in terms of thinking about risks.
How are they I wasn't, they're in plain English, sort of, do they speak in plain English? Just think about the public and, you know.
Yeah.
For the most
Are
part.
they good at that?
Thank you. I didn't find it quite as much as I would hope, and encourage them to think about that, and they recognize that as important.
Good. Which is another reason for us to digest it and present it in our own plain English, right?
Yeah.
You know, at some point, their being our
Absolutely.
expert is gonna have to be an interface with the public, and it needs to be a little bit more common.
Yeah.
Respectfully, than they were talking to us, but they were talking to us. They knew that. They knew there's a difference.
Sure.
And-
Yeah.
And I highlighted the importance of that, and they're aware of it.
Good. That's good.
That one communication of risk assessment can be pretty straightforward until you get into 10 to the -6. So you get into the meaning of those numbers,
Right.
which may seem obvious or not, but you know, it's, I don't know, you're looking at me strangely, but I mean, but you
Well,
deal with this all the time.
Safe is in the eye of the beholder, and that's what that conversation is gonna boil down to for
Right.
the perceiver at public level. So that's why the clarity and common language of the presentation, things like, leave the details out,
Yeah,
but that's why that's important, because
Risks that represent 10 to the -6, 10 to the -5, 10 to the -4 that you can, you know.
you
Sure.
can give them examples, but examples are dangerous for a different reason that we don't have to get into at this point.
Yeah.
But, and enough said,
Yeah.
they understand
They
the
do.
importance that their expertise needs to be translated into language that is usable by the public.
Mm.
And that way the public will respect them as trying to talk to them on their level, and they'll have more trust in the information they convey, and that's the best chance.
They're a sophisticated group. They've done litigation work, for example. So when you're in the court, you have to explain things to a jury or the finders of fact, and you can't lose them in the weeds. So I think,
Well, they know, they have experience with communicating to the public. They proposed to add a whole extra scope of work that included, we can do that for you too, remember, at the beginning?
Mm.
So yes, they claim, I don't know Lou, but they said they have experience with that, and I trust them.
one thing before he leaves, one thing that, in the context of becoming a bona fide BFPP, there is a requirement to do a due diligence and phase 1 due diligence or AAI investigation. So what they're doing here is a good first step. So they've actually offered to later on to help the town with that piece. I think they'd be a logical group because they know the site to do a phase 1, which is not a big deal, especially if you know about the history of the site and all the data. So, I mean, that's down the road, but I think that there's a connection between what they're doing now and perhaps phase 1 due diligence, I think.
Paul, could I just ask one question on the assumptions slide? The last bullet point I didn't understand. assumes clean fill shielding left at 10 feet, the greater than 10 feet. That just means that nobody's gonna scrape it away. Is that what that means?
So that means that if something radioactive were 10 feet below, you're implying that 10 feet would be enough for you to be able to sit on top of it and not be exposed.
The
We
10
don't
feet of
have
clean
any
fill acts
chemicals
as a
at the
complete.
site.
In other words, if there's 10 feet of clean fill over it.
Yeah.
There's no
Increased
radioactive
exposure.
exposure.
Exactly. No
Okay.
increase.
But the other thing is that we don't have actually any radionuclides at this site that you would require 10 feet of fill to be safe from. Basically, 2 feet is more than enough for the worst of the worst, and the worst of the worst is sitting on the bedrock at the bottom of the holding basin.
The area of the site where this is probably most relevant is the holding basin.
Mhm.
And we learned today that they're still revising and improving the holding basin design, so I think Rue needs to get plugged into. So the latest holding basin design, which has the cap and it has the fill and then it has soil over it and has. So it only takes several feet of soil to kind of shield any kind of. This radionuclide issue, even if there were significant issues.
Did you get clarity today on how many feet of soil will be above the clay cap or?
So it's not really a clay cap, it's
It's a rubber.
geotechnical clay cap, so clay is built into a solid piece of.
Matrix?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's, it looks like it's
4 feet?
4 feet above that was my.
Total, there was a clay level and then there was another
Right.
thing and the whole thing totaled for,
Over the.
There's a
over the-
warning
over the
level.
plastic sheeting
Yeah.
to simplify it, right?
2 feet of topsoil and then
Yeah.
fill underneath it.
Plastic, then the 50 mil polyethylene stuff,
Yeah.
it's just a whole lot of things going into the
Yeah.
layers that are
But
not
the
gonna be
total of all
water
layers
soluble.
is 4 feet.
Yeah, but don't forget,
Or
plastic is going on top of all the buildup that they've done with clean fill to bring the cap that was already there on top of that up to the level that they could put their crane on, and that all counts as buffer to what's underneath too.
Right.
So it's not just the 4 feet on top of the new cap, it's the 10 to
They've had to
15
build up,
feet
yeah,
between
right.
cap A and cap B that they've added so that they can do their construction. That's all buffer.
That's all
That
clean
data
fill.
Yes.
came out last week about what the fill was that was put on top of the holding basin.
Yeah.
Material to bring it to grade. So there's actually a characterization of that. I don't know if Rue would like that data, because that does describe that there is already a nice buffer between what's underneath the holding basin. You can walk on top of the holding basin right now without
We did.
being concerned.
You're close. Okay.
Yeah, that would be relevant. I think
Um,
that would be relevant.
are we set to move on to? So the cousin of risk is reuse. I'm sharing now. So this, I had asked Gary and Rich to kind of brief everybody on the reuse scenarios that they have been working with Carl and Carrie on and sort of where we are in that. So take it away, guys.
You wanna start and then we'll
Okay.
pick up at the scenario design?
Yeah, well, why don't we go to, so this is our fact-finding approach. And, 3 reports most people are familiar with, I think, the long-range plan, Envision Concord, the housing production plan, which shows the need for housing and, specific sites, not including this one. And then the reuse report that's already been done. There are 2 relevant reports that we haven't really seen. One, Paul, maybe you know where this is, and that's the Recreation Strategic Plan. I did see, when I interviewed the Recreation Department, a drawing that essentially would use all the non-conservation areas of the site for recreation. But there was no prioritization within that, and I don't know where that is now, so.
The plan's going out for public comment on Friday, so you'll see it.
So, but the fact is, we don't have any prioritization information at this point from recreation, but maybe that will be in the report. And then, as we learned, the town is doing facility study, but it won't be available till after we report. So, we reached out to all the departments, that had a potential interest. The ones we did not talk to were the schools, which, said they weren't interested. And public safety was not interested, at least as a site for their activities. So those are the two town functions we didn't talk to. If you-
You probably answered my question because you didn't talk to them, but did you get any sense as to why they weren't interested?
Well, schools, it's
They have
Pretty-
enough, they have enough space
no,
or
it's
you wouldn't want to
pretty
be on.
obvious, right?
Well,
School
that's why it
kids,
was-
yeah, I
That's
think
why I
there's,
wanted to hear that articulated.
they have other
They-
opportunities
they-
and
And so they had, it wasn't that you couldn't get in touch with them.
Oh, no, no.
It was,
Yeah.
so what were
They're-
their reasons for not wanting to,
This-
which would be, I mean, I can imagine, but I just
it
want.
was not articulated, but it was conveyed.
And
Thanks,
right
but-
now, there's a site that they're saying
they
is
got
the
to have
foundation
other-
for something else.
And what
Right?
about?
And they've already
So
got
public
their,
safety, it's more just, it's not centrally located. It's like couldn't be further to the edge and they want central locations to deploy
Okay.
emergency assets quickly.
Okay, so this is who we did talk to, in the town, the Economic Vitality Manager and separately the Economic Vitality Committee. The point that I heard most vociferously there, but I'm not sure whether that represents the opinion of the whole committee, is we want more commercial because we want fewer students and, you know, more tax revenue. But I'm not sure whether that was a governing principle for the whole committee. Transportation, we talked to the chair of the committee and the town's planner. We talked to the Council on Aging. As you'll see later, they have interest, but not interest in moving Harvey Wheeler out there, because they want it to be close to the library and the things that go on in West Concord without having to drive. Recreation Department, we've talked about, talked to planning and land use, public works. I would say compared to the earlier study, more possible willingness to move. The comment that struck me was when Alan said, well, sometimes our guys don't come back for lunch because the traffic's so bad, they eat where they're working. So, you know, that may be a possibility. And then we talked to the light board, which tended to have a fairly short-term focus. But we also talked to the solar implementation task force, and they have an active interest. And there is one very special aspect of the site you'll hear about in a minute that makes them very interested, not just for panels, but for something else.
But that's something, is wind in the picture? Or-
No, well, I'll say it now. There is a major substation just up the hill.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, the long-term plan is when everybody has solar panels, we'll have more solar during the day than we need. And we want to hold it, or we want to be able to buy off-peak power at lower rates. So they want a battery site
Batteries, right.
that would be as close as possible to the substation to put it back into the
Yeah,
grid,
right.
which makes sense. The development community, we talked to Mass Development, which is the state agency that has managed the reuse of a couple of the state hospital sites, extensively involved at Devon's. And, you know, they didn't say, oh, yeah, but they said, yeah, potentially we could take it and develop it, or potentially we could work for you as your development department. So, you know, interest there. And then,
Pardon me interrupting.
oh,
Did
no,
they say that there were any programs to actively help us, grant programs or?
They said Carl would know.
They have some programs, I mean,
Awesome.
they have some planning. that's-
Ask Carl.
I remember seeing that email.
They have a lot of financing programs that
Cool.
would be like debt financing for developers, you know, or nonprofits or something.
and then, for developers, we talked to a developer of major affordable housing projects, mostly in cities, but who's knowledgeable about the industry as well. major private developers combine commercial and residential, including some of the stuff that was built on the sites at Woburn. The opinion there, and actually from the local developers at Devon's, is that the paramount demand, or, you know, the highest and best use for developers, if they could acquire it, would be housing. That they don't think it's a particularly attractive site for commercial. And that was before FCI Concord, quote unquote, came on the market.
Mhm.
So I think, you know, given the traffic on 62 and the distance from Route 2, they all talked about housing rather than.
Right.
We think we need another, Gary and I disagree a little bit on this, but I want one more large developer to say the same thing we heard from the guy who worked for Cabot, Kevin Forbes, because I'm fairly sure that's correct. But I think we'll potentially be criticized if we say, no, this, if you're gonna do something with this in the private sector, it's residential and not commercial. I'd like one more data point.
Rich, how would I call it a partnership, but how would the town work with mass development? I don't know if there's a short answer to that. If
Well,
the
I
town
think
acquired the site, could they outsource the development activity to a state agency, or would they have to be a part? What kind of?
they could do it two ways. Mass development could take the site and then
When you
manage
take
it
this,
for
take the
mixed
site,
use.
you mean acquire the site?
Yeah.
So mass
Mass
development
development.
acquire the site.
They've done that with
They
part
have
of
done it.
Pittsfield, the GE Pittsfield site.
They did that with
With
Devon's
Devon's,
too, right?
yeah, with Devon's.
So,
Or they can work as essentially our, you know, if we acquire it and say, we want these municipal things, but we want these non-municipal things, they could be a development agent.
They have some agreements to manage and develop properties on behalf of the state.
Yeah.
The Gloucester State Fish Pier, the New Bedford and.
Well, and the old state hospitals
State
at
hospital.
Northampton,
Right,
Belchertown.
where they, you know, it's in the development.
but note that we said they could acquire the site, not that they would. So there's a dialogue and discussion. as to
But
what's-
you should be clear, they're not gonna do it for free.
Right,
Right.
there's a
You're
negotiation.
gonna
That's,
have to
that's
pay their
exactly my
staff
point,
and
yeah.
overhead. You know, it's not gonna be without
But
cost
if the
to
town,
to
you know,
do that.
really is adamant, we do not want to acquire this site, there is an avenue there.
An avenue where the town would still have influence over the development.
Well, yeah, to the extent that this is all gonna be one big negotiation. Just like, you know, acquiring the site would be one big negotiation, and we don't wanna talk about it outside of executive session, but you know, Mina knows. What would
I mean,
go
if-
into getting loans forgiven by EPA and things like that,
I
and
mean,
you know,
you think
similarly.
of Devon's as a model,
Yeah.
There was a reuse plan that was
Yeah.
approved
Yeah.
by the three towns. That, you know, had land on the site. And then mass development actually acquires and develops the site, and then there's a permitting body, the Devon's Enterprise Commission. That reviews and approves projects, so you could have like a town body that.
Yeah.
That
But it-
plays that role or something, and theoretically, obviously, it would probably require.
But-
Some agreement and maybe some statute.
Right, and so just to, you know, talk about the shape of that negotiation, I mean, it's a different negotiation
Yeah,
than with
definitely.
EPA, it's more what's in the state's interest here. So, you know, if we want them to acquire the site, and then we wanna do 100% municipal uses on the
Right.
site,
They're
that's
not gonna
not
do
really
that.
gonna be aligned
Right.
with
Right.
their interest, so.
Yeah,
It's-
they have
there's
an
gonna have-
economic development
Right.
mission, so
And,
they're
yeah,
gonna,
and I mean, I think that would include
housing,
housing,
that would.
They did
absolutely,
housing.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah. no,
housing at
absolutely.
Devon's,
I
housing
think
at
housing is seen as an economic development.
Yeah, right.
Right, I think the question is, how do we get it to not be 100% housing, and I think they're open to a discussion about, you know, what other municipal uses might align well with their economic development priorities,
Yeah, oh, interesting.
which
Okay.
I think we'll come to on the next slide, but I don't know,
That would be
Okay,
good.
well, you wanna talk to this one and then I'll do this?
yeah, you wanna do the next? So we started with the site master plan from the previous task force. Thinking about the various areas, you know, crudely how contaminated they are, the topography, the accessibility, and you'll see that in the next slide. the uses we identified are based on express need and demand. You'll see there's one little piece of quantification we did. The rest is, yeah, residential, or yes, the town is thinking about moving, consolidating town offices. And consistent with the available space, none of this assumes that B and D would be used at all. And most of C1 and C2, although I can see some uses that might lap over into some of the conservation areas, but they would be, recreational or conservation. And, risk compatibility, we don't know, but we're working, when people say housing, we're saying, well, if it's clean to residential standard. And I will say, when we talked to developers, several of them, we said, well, what about the site? And they said, it's not really been a problem. That, it may just be generational change, that people forget how awful it was. But anyhow, I didn't hear anybody who has done housing think that you couldn't do housing on this site and that they couldn't sell the apartments or homes or whatever was built. So we created 3 scenarios. They're neither exclusive nor definitive. In other words, there's essentially a private acquisition, a town acquires with some private uses, and a town acquires for all its uses scenario.
Do you want me to flip ahead to those?
Just let me say one more thing, but what I want to stress is that, we're not saying these are the only things in these categories that could go there. We're saying this is where we've heard, a desire to use the space that might translate into effective demand, if you will.
And just on the heading there, input for rough infrastructure cost estimate, like just to say, that really sells it short. I mean, the construction of these 3 scenarios was really, not to sound too much like a mathematician, but to define the vector space. I mean, we're really trying to put together 3 illustrative scenarios that in combination would define what is the envelope of infrastructure costs that the town could expect? What is the envelope of development costs that a developer could expect? What is the envelope of municipal range of municipal uses and so forth? Not trying to, as we've said, be definitive as to, this is the scenario that will go there. Because the truth is, none of us on this committee will probably have any role in determining what the use that will ultimately go there after 2027. It's going to be a future committee that will decide what actually goes there, but.
That first bullet said private sector acquires. Could you also have mass development acquires and facilities?
The idea here was that it would be, the town would not have any skin in the game. If you
Maybe
will.
we shouldn't have said acquire, but the point is private sector develops. Even if mass development acquires the site, chances are they would probably put out a RFP or a bid for a private developer to come in. So that's.
I mean, I think there was really, that's.
Yeah.
The private, the non-municipal development
Right.
ownership entity
Right.
is gonna have to pay for the
But
infrastructure.
Hold your question until we come to that scenario.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's go on the next thing. Next slide, I wanted to just, and I had a catchy animation if this was in PowerPoint mode, but since it's PDF, you won't see it. But there were a bunch of municipal uses or municipal opportunities that we thought spanned all 3 scenarios. So I just wanted to present them on one slide. Should a private acquirer or a private developer be willing to negotiate with the town and be open to providing easements, or should the town acquire and we think about areas that are good for development and areas that are good for other things? There were sort of these 5 potential uses that seemed like they would make sense with almost any combination. So I just wanted to run through this quickly. One is, conservation, passive recreation. As we say, area one now, which is our, reuse area C1 and C2. We've talked about this in this committee, in the prior committee. I think everybody thinks, since it's generally untouched and pristine wild area, we should leave it as a pristine wild area. But that isn't to say that having a couple of trails run through there wouldn't be a good idea, and maybe a viewing platform or something like that. So having the town have some easement or right of access for passive recreation on that makes sense. A pollinator meadow on B, there's virtually nothing that can go on the holding basin, but a pollinator meadow is consistent with at least NRC desires and is consistent with what the cap would support, and an annual mow would be totally consistent with a pollinator meadow and consistent with not allowing trees to grow there. So it seems like that would make sense. I'm not sure any private developer would have an interest in owning the holding basin or, doing anything on the holding basin anyway. So those two seemed like they could make sense in all scenarios. Number one, I don't know, or yeah, 3, I guess it is. There's a little 3 up on Route 62, which is a space for a transportation node. This is not, a massive parking garage or anything like that. It's intended to be just basically a bus stop if we have a public transit.
Yeah, and a few temporary parking spaces for a kiss and ride kind of thing like they have in Alewife.
Yeah. So that also seemed like, the town would want to reserve the right to have some kind of a bus stop along there if that's feasible. And that would, I think, also be aligned with other development opportunities. Like if a private developer were to put, a bunch of condos on A1, they might be amenable and happy about having a public transit node right there. 4th, this is coming from the NRC, but you'll notice at the bottom of A4, the southern edge of A4, directly outside of the property line, that's all town conservation land. There are trails that already exist out there, and it's a very narrow strip. And the NRC has said, listen, if you're gonna inherit or whatever, acquire or have access to 46 new acres, could we just widen that strip a little bit? So the idea is maybe we could think about broadening that buffer so that we don't, build right up to the property line where the conservation, these trails are already sitting. So that would be, something that the NRC is interested in. And then the 5th is what we talked about, or what Rich talked about before, battery storage. That is that corner of the site. In fact, that's probably what that easement is right there, right? That little strip is probably the easement to the grid.
To the substation.
The far left corner of 5. There's a little green area
Is that
outside.
the hill with the trees on it that Pam was?
No,
referring to?
No,
up here.
that's, the hill is
Up
A2.
Okay.
So,
What I'm saying is I bet this is owned by the town of Concord for the purpose of.
I don't think it's owned, but we already have an easement there.
this is the hill.
Right,
Well, that's,
Well,
But,
that's the Minuteman Art Building.
yeah,
Um,
that's.
but inside the property in that area is.
Oh,
where
there is
the-
one there.
Yeah.
Where's the hill? Oh, the hill's up here. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah, okay.
Anyway, so next slide, then we can talk about the 3 scenarios. So the first scenario is, this is the one you were mentioning, Paul, is, if either a private developer or mass development were to acquire the site and the town did not acquire the site, on the right-hand side, I just mentioned in the prior slides, I think we still could have a discussion with whoever acquires about some of these other uses that might be useful. But what we've learned through our interviews and our discussions with developers is they're likely to look at the same kind of model that you see on Baker Avenue and what you're seeing proposed at the Thoreau Club. There's 2 40Bs that have been proposed in recent days, and they look like that. Similar to what has already been built at Muse or, anyway.
There is a significant groundswell of negativity of putting none of the residents of Thoreau there, because another mega development, you already have the Muse up there. And to propose even another one here, we gotta be
Well,
mindful
Right,
of,
well, we wouldn't be proposing, this is, we're doing this scenario because our intelligence is telling us that if we don't acquire, this is what developers are looking for.
Like we're gonna.
no,
I think
look at the
also,
Veronica.
also from an infrastructure cost point of view, I mean, that would call for a larger septic system.
Yeah.
Perhaps, so, just to kind of
So
understand.
there may be
what
some
the
limits as to
impact-
what they can do.
What
That's a
the
good point.
impact of
I
it.
mean, part of the problem is when you look at developers to get some affordable units and something approximating market rate, it's gotta be a big project, because there's so much upfront cost that, and because the financing gets complex, and
So
You know,
it's a bit of a warning shot.
when you get all the lawyers in the room, all you can hear is their meters run.
Yeah, that's
Um,
the downside of tax credit.
Yeah, right. So, basically, they want to do $100 million projects. They're not gonna wanna build tiny houses or maybe even, plan residential developments as we think of them around here with 10 or 12 units or something.
This is what they tried to do in Ashland too, and then Ashland had to buy the property to control what was put on that.
But, if the town doesn't wanna buy it, then you can confront, you may be able to control it through zoning, but I think you might have some legal issues, if you try and prevent any, and that if it's not zone multifamily, then no developer may want it. Then who's gonna take it? If the town doesn't want it.
Can't do, probably by that time, 40Bs won't be needed, right?
In my days with Concord Housing Trust, before the town had certain rights that it didn't have then, they had to be a nonprofit. We built several, up to like 5 homes, 3 homes, 5 homes, all affordable, but we could only do it because we got the land for free.
Yeah.
For whatever, and assistance from the town and bringing in utilities and that kind of stuff. There was no way, and we're talking, over 20 years ago,
Yeah, and it's.
that we
it's-
could
it's
have done
worse.
that in Concord.
Without the transfer fee, it's gonna be almost impossible to do small scale.
Mhm.
I think if you had the transfer fee, you could do a couple of those projects.
I think it's an interesting scenario. I just wonder how practical it is, from two perspectives. It would require a lot of negotiation between any private purchaser and the town to get this limited carve out, right? That's a significant negotiation, and the other part is, the bar is very high for any private purchaser, in terms of liens and, but that doesn't mean you could overcome a $20 million entry.
Or you could
cost.
even think of this as a mass development acquisition and.
Yeah, I mean, it's
possible.
possible, it's possible, the value may be there, it's not
A
for us to judge
couple
that.
towns did that, Salem, Ashland acquired the land with the intent to move it on toward private development.
We did ask private developers, what about, some uses that are essentially public? Would you do, an easement or a long-term lease? We didn't at that point ask about battery storage. We did ask about the bus stop and the idea of a dog park or a fitness trail or something like that. And they said, yeah, we've done that in places.
I mean, to some extent, they're amenities.
Yeah.
Some of them are
Yeah, right,
amenities
yeah.
for the residents and,
Well, and the whole conservation area, and the
Right.
developer wouldn't have any.
right,
use
and
for
a lot
that.
of it's on land that
Well,
you can't use anyway.
So to come back to Carl's point, but you could think of this as a model of also a mass development, taking acquisition, but hold on, because that comes back to the element of negotiation. Remember, these 3 scenarios are designed to define the space, to define the envelope. If we go on to the second scenario, which Rich is gonna speak to, that also could be, even though it's, town acquires, that also could be done collaboratively with mass
Yeah.
development. And the question is part of the negotiation, like mass development clearly is interested in this. They want housing right now. Would they be interested in scenario 2? That's a question. Maybe they would be open to more of the negotiation if,
In the,
Anyway, I'll let you
in
speak
the interest of
to
time, let's move to,
Yeah.
I'd like to get through this next,
so move to scenario 2, yes.
yeah. move on.
Okay, this is the town acquires, but, allows for, if you will, sort of non-municipal uses through long-term lease or something of the sort. And one of the needs that came up in our discussions, both with the Council on Aging and Economic Development, is the lack of affordable assisted living facilities. So I ran the numbers, and that bar graph to the right is just taking the current age cohorts every 5 years, currently over 35, and running them forward with national mortality data and saying, you know, if nobody moves in or out of town in that age cohort, how many people are left at those dates? And as you can see, you know, you're looking, if you assume when you're over 80, you're a candidate for one of these facilities, you're looking at a major increase. And in fact, we know the private sector was interested because they wanted to do Junction Village. So, you know, the private uses with the town acquired would be assisted living. And at the very end of our explorations, we heard that, yeah, Minuteman might be interested in a single room occupancy, something less than a group home, but, you know, more than separate units. We threw 5 in there. I don't know if that's the right number. We'll try and get some more. And then the town uses that we talked about. And we think that would leave something on the order of 6 acres that could be used for playing fields, fitness area, dog park, those kinds of things. And then.
But the other point is, you know, while this scenario is designed to be, you know, a town acquisition scenario, it could be the town acquires in collaboration with mass development again. But it also could be the town just acquires it outright and then we put out an RFP, you know, for a bidder like Grantham, or maybe not Grantham, but maybe a different assisted living developer.
Different
that wants it.
developer or a different select.
So, you know, it could be either way. And so again, you know, some of these town uses that, you know, are still there and the recreation, it's part of either a negotiation, or if the town acquires, we don't have to negotiate, we're in control.
So the idea here is, because as we said earlier, the likely decisions on all of this are gonna be years
Yeah, down
away.
the road.
And this group is not gonna do that. So the objective here is to sort of paint a broad brush to show what, I mean, what is your objective, given the
provide-
fact that
yeah,
you're not gonna have
right.
any role?
To provide
in this?
illustrative scenarios that enable Carl and Carrie to answer questions about what would the cost of these various development scenarios, what would the infrastructure needs that the town would have to, what would be the impact on town services like schools, town
Right.
impact on emergency,
Yeah, I was just
all
gonna
of those
say-
things, but also to enable a risk assessment from the other work group
Right.
to be able to say all of these sites, or, you know, all of these uses, or some of these uses are appropriate in these different locations, some may not be, but also, you know, to be able to communicate to the public that there's, so we're
Well,
creating
But
these
you're
scenarios
also-
for a lot of
But
reasons.
we're also
the-
realizing that these are illustrative things that
Yes.
are theoretical largely, that enable a kind of thought process and an understanding. of-
trying to-
well, I
But
think
it's
that,
not gonna, it's not
I
gonna
should
get
say,
very granular.
the impetus for this came when, Megan organized a meeting, you know, with town staff that usually meet to review development proposals, to kind of talk about the site and trying to get, you know, estimates for what the impact would be on town infrastructure costs, town operating costs. So that's where, at least some town departments said, well, we could help you if we had some scenarios.
Yeah.
And
Well-
that was sort of the first
I
impetus.
think equally important, I mean, more important. This provides a vision to the select board, a vision based on data that you acquired from talking to real departments and people, based on real needs. If the town were to acquire for municipal purposes only, and with a caveat on cost, you could satisfy these needs. And I think the select board has to know that, as opposed to the previous report did kind of the same things, but it wasn't as granular as this in terms of.
Well, but to the point he raised, like, you know, we came up with tiny houses, like, yeah, that'd be cool, but, you know,
Yeah.
what we're hearing is
Yeah,
no
it's
developers gonna
based
build
on
tiny houses.
real conversations with people.
Yeah.
That's for people who already have the land.
Yeah.
Or in a trailer park. What I was gonna say is, one of the big differences between this and scenario one is scenario one, a muse type housing development is gonna bring kids to school.
Yep.
This is not gonna bring kids to school. This is going to provide a way for senior citizens or those of us who are approaching that title
And we'll have,
to remain in town
And we'll have different
And-
traffic impacts on 62. It
Right,
will have different
right,
septic
right,
impacts.
right.
Right.
It will have very different,
Right.
so
Right.
it,
Different-
So
different
it's,
emergency
it's
services.
housing, it fills a need
Okay,
without
let's move on to the
creating
last
as
scenario,
many
'cause-
pressures, it seems.
Want to do this one?
sure, sure.
Okay.
I mean,
Doesn't
last
mean-
scenario is basically town acquires and we use it, the whole thing. So we leave private development out. We just say, look, what are the town needs? We've already heard, you know, there's a facilities plan being undertaken and one of the options is people are eyeing this building. Oh, this would be a great spot for housing. Well, where's DPW gonna go? Where's planning gonna go? So if we had that site, you know, basically looking at a 23,000 square foot administrative building, 90,000 square foot DPW building and free up this land, put solar on the roofs and over parking and then, you know, again, there's no restriction on us doing all 5 of the things that we
Right.
really wanted to do in terms of those other parts of the land. And then also have, you know, some opportunity for recreation.
Do any of the scenarios satisfy sort of in-ground solar? Because speaking to the solar guy, so it's much more cost effective. And efficient energy wise to put solar in the ground as opposed to on top of buildings.
The only
Just
conversation,
solar fields.
Scenario 2, I think we put in some,
You want to go back?
No, I'm just, it would have to
I
build
think we
something.
have solar in two.
I know, but if you go back to scenario 2, we had
Solar field.
solar field for
Yeah,
5
5
acres.
acres,
There's a 5
okay, got
acres.
that.
So, you know,
Yeah, it's gonna take that much unless you put it on.
well, that's what we
Okay.
talked to Dean Banfield about, and he's like,
Okay.
yeah, we would want at least 5.
And
Excellent.
just one of the articles that was taken up at last night's hearing was about putting a cell tower
Mhm.
on this
Yeah.
site. And talked about how
Right.
it wouldn't mess anything up because it's already a mess. That was basically what I was hearing between the lines. And so I don't know if that would come up in discussion or what is going to happen with that article before it gets to town
Mhm.
meeting.
I think once cell towers are in place, then people sort of forget that they're there.
This is a really nice piece of work. So this was put together expeditiously to kind of feed into, you know,
For the integration.
would, in the write-up in the report on reuse, would follow the same general theme here? Scenarios, or would you do something different in a report? What do you-
Well,
what do you
I think, you know, I've been looking forward for a while, been looking forward to this integration period, March. Because I think we're gonna learn a lot about the risk assessment and do these scenarios hold water? So I can imagine that these scenarios might change depending on what you tell us about acquisition and negotiation and what you tell us about costs and infrastructure and like what, you know, I was not thinking in terms of what you just said about septic. So I can imagine it'll change a little bit.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
No.
I think it would be important, I just want to inject one thing, thinking down the road for our second public meeting,
Yeah.
which I think will probably involve workshop areas, you know, you guys worked on this and people can go and talk to the reuse people and so forth, that these are framed as possibilities, illustrative, but
Yeah.
examples of.
Well, that's, we, you know, we wanted to give us the right words, because I totally agree with
Also,
you.
I think the nice thing about these scenarios too is they do take the actual site, the size of the site, the limitations of the site, you know, what could actually fit, what combination of things could actually fit.
Oh, and
Which in the first reuse plan, we never, I mean, it was never
Yeah.
really thought through that carefully.
the clarity of the specifics is very helpful,
Yeah.
very helpful, but it risks bumping up against
Yeah,
somebody
oh, yeah,
else's
that-
notion.
oh,
But
But I mean,
Yeah.
you know,
They're
maybe
gonna
we-
they're gonna put in an assisted
Right.
living facility.
Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
want
No,
you,
that isn't.
I don't want you to mess with that,
That's
it's
not
got
what we're
trees on
saying
it,
here.
et cetera. So just
Yeah.
that they're, you know, a way of refining
Yeah.
the general ideas of possible use beyond what the first reuse group
Yeah,
did, so that you have some
Right,
concrete
yeah,
notion.
right.
something like working models, or, you know,
We
we
can
gotta
worry
come
about
up
the
with.
wording, but
Yeah.
I just wanted to plant the seed.
So let's move it to the final big agenda item, which if you can cover it in 10 to 15 minutes. I asked David to, we talked the schedule last time, and we said we should probably have a public hearing. Sort of as the next step on what we're finding. I'll call it findings sort of thing, as opposed to decisions or recommendations, so somewhere between plans and decisions, or what we know. So it could lead us into thinking about the,
Well, there's some broad thoughts, and then I can describe kind of what I thought might work, but this is just to get discussion going. I'm not right or wrong, and I don't have any slides. The first broad point is the timing is early June,
yes, the schedule I threw out for
tentative,
you.
tentative.
Yeah, tentatively, because it seemed to work out with everything else.
Yeah, with everything else. So let's think about the purpose of the second meeting, what we wanted to accomplish. We want to demonstrate transparency and openness. We want to get people's feeling of inclusion, not only for our work, but subsequent work that will lead to the actual site acquisition decision by the town. We're setting the stage for the politics down the road. One of the, not concerns, that's the wrong word. Well, one of the thoughts that I had was how many people are gonna come in early June? If we frame this as we have talked about, which is, we're getting close to where we're gonna start debating amongst ourselves what to recommend to the town, but we haven't decided that. So on the threshold of that, we want to bring you up to date with what our work groups have done. That's kind of the general framing of it. How many people are gonna come to that? In early June?
More than in July and August.
Yeah.
Yeah, true. So let's not hold it in July and August,
Yeah.
but now let's get back
Before
to
school
June.
gets
Yeah,
started.
So
no,
I'm
let's
gonna-
get back to June.
I'm gonna be answered facetiously, really depends on our marketing plan. And how we,
Yeah.
what we say about the value for people attending it.
Mhm.
If it's, people came, we had 100 people attending, so here are their plans. Now we're gonna give them hopefully real meat. Here's what we're finding. I think people will be interested in like real findings. I mean, so to answer your question, I don't know, but last night, how many people come to town meeting? How do you get people to town meeting? You have to have topics that are interesting. We have to make this interesting for people to be there to learn.
And what I was gonna recommend is that we make it sound as concrete as possible.
Oh, yeah,
Again, the
absolutely.
Warner's Pond example of the vague, nobody came, nobody cared, no friction. The more concrete it sounds, the more they wanna make sure their foot is in the door. So all possible. I just wanted to put that issue on the table in terms of what will the meeting accomplish if we hold it then? What's the goal of the meeting?
Well, what is the goal of the meeting? I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The
right.
idea is that, number one, I mean, I looked at the charge doesn't contemplate, it mentions 2 times, I think that I'm not a big fan of over meeting this town. I think the town meets too much, frankly, generally. And I think that having clear objectives is very important, and I think that a big question is, is the town gonna be commenting, or is the town gonna be getting information from us? I mean, so what are we trying to accomplish?
Can I just,
And-
before you answer, originally I had thought we would do the initial meeting and sort of a final meeting when we had our recommendations. This group at one of our last meetings said, no, we need another briefing for the public in between. So that's the genesis of,
Well,
Why we're
no,
talking about
I'm
this.
suggesting.
so that, but your question is right now. So what we
But
would,
now let's discuss that more
Yeah.
fully, because it was a very
It
casual.
was a casual
It was a
discussion.
very casual, maybe we need another one. So
But
this is the
there's
conversation
the
about
most Conversation that
No,
really.
the-
was.
whether we
question is
really do
apropos.
and how and
that's
stuff.
why we're discussing it.
So what we'll be able to present them is what you just did on Reeves, is what the details are that you know, that you can talk about publicly, about legal. I don't know how enticing our concrete product can be that we'll offer to get people to come and participate.
I think there are 2 things. One is that meeting will kind of force us to package and communicate what we learned and what we think its implications are for what we'll ultimately recommend. And so beyond the meeting itself, we will have created a summary of our work.
Do we need the meeting scheduled in order to do that?
No, but yeah, I mean.
Maybe.
Well,
It helps.
well,
It's a
but
question.
just put that aside, not necessarily, but it is a, collateral benefit, so to speak,
Yeah.
that will come out of that. And if that will give us another tool to engage with the community and to sort of bring more stakeholders within the community along our work. So that when we do ultimately make recommendations, there will have been some foundation for that.
That's the value of the meeting today, is to bring the stakeholders
Right.
along.
Right.
And well, it's marketing our ultimate product. It's to have that relationship building continue so that when our recommendations go in, people have felt included and
And people who come to that meeting can then take some of that back to other
So
organizations. that are part of it.
acquisition-
Gary had a question. I'm trying to go
Well,
down.
I mean, I'm just trying to have this more full discussion, and to me, it seems like this meeting, if we can bring to it packaged, concrete information about where all the work streams are, I feel like we're a lot further along than we all think we are, and I feel like we're basically ready to go out for comment from the public on what we've learned, and based on that, if we come up with I'm still not convinced we're gonna come to a recommendation. So there is a question, do we need a third meeting? I feel like this is the meeting we need. We get the public input, the public feedback, we use that to either formulate a recommendation or write our report. And yeah, there's public comment on a public document, so we'll have a
Well,
public
let
document.
me ask you a question though.
But I feel like this is the moment where we package our material and engage.
So when you said, and we get the public feedback,
Yeah,
to what end? You
Yeah.
guys have talked to developers, you guys are talking to the lawyers. I mean,
because the
to-
public wants to be
Well,
consulted and the
that's a
select,
relationship building
right,
thing.
and the
Yeah.
select board wants to ensure that we have engaged.
Yeah.
Is that true? I mean.
Yes.
for the-
But it's not so much
Ask Terry, every time I talk to her over the last
Okay, could be.
3 years.
That's true, but
make
to
sure
keep the
there's
goal in mind, that's a relationship building purpose rather than us learning stuff about specific input from the public. All right.
Yeah, no,
We
I,
don't want to surprise the public with any.
yeah,
with any-
exactly.
With any finding or recommendation.
Oh,
Where did-
God, they're considering
where did-
housing.
Where did that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So is it a comment? Is it, what is this, is it a comment receiving meeting or is it a information giving meeting or both?
It's
or-
framed as a conversation
Mhm.
where people can come and ask questions or offer their input to the specific 4 working groups. We have to redefine them slightly because they mean stuff to us that the words don't mean to the public. But that's minor details, right? Where people can hear an overview of what we've done so far and then go to the 4 tables or whatever presentations in the various working groups and find out the details of where it looks like we're heading towards reuse, or where it looks like we're heading towards the legal acquisition. And the purpose of that is so that they feel in conversation with that, so that when we make our recommendations, we've done it.
And don't surprise them.
Carrie, did you have a comment?
Well,
I know
actually-
that Pam did. I
Yeah.
want the task force to finish.
Uh, I wanted to ask a question of Chris.
Okay.
Is there any way that you know how many people have tuned into a recording of our first public meeting? I mean, or how many people? We know we don't see very many people tuning in on our meetings. But is there a way to know how many people look at them later or?
Yeah, for the first public forum, we had Zoom can produce a list of attendees, and then we also collected the number of people who signed in. So I can't remember what the number was, it was around 100 or so, but yeah, we have that ability to collect.
And the
data.
EPA meeting had however many people in the room, times that again online,
Mhm.
roughly.
It was very
Yeah.
similar. It was like.
Yeah,
four-
so
Remember-
is it, is it 102 people who are watching everything?
But
Or
that's
is
not-
it 350 people who are watching this bit and
It's
that bit?
it's only kind of helpful to think of that, because A, that was who we are, we're introducing ourselves to town, so it's a differently framed thing. And B, it's not in the beginning of June.
But it's not in the beginning.
The second one that one wasn't in the beginning of June, so the comparators are not,
No,
they're
yeah.
little apples and
Yeah.
oranges.
Yeah, that's
Okay,
true.
I'm
We don't
not-
have that much else to do.
Topic, timing.
I'm not gonna worry right now about how many people will come.
I'm
So-
curious because I want to
I'm
know, are
worried
people
about, do we-
actually
do
paying
we- do we have a
attention?
reason to, do we have enough information that the
That's-
public should be aware of? And
Exactly.
if there are 5 people there or 100 people there, yeah, it may define whether you have working groups or not, but But, I think that we have something to tell the public.
That's the second point that I was going to make.
Yeah.
Do we have evidence of progress?
I think so.
And I think it's obvious that we do, but that's in terms of thinking of the goal of the meeting.
That's gonna build trust in our.
This meeting's gonna
conclusions.
get covered in the bridge, right? It's gonna get to a lot of other people. We need to that's another goal of the meeting in my mind. So we need to demonstrate that we're moving ahead, A, and B, getting towards the decision point.
I just, an anecdote, we had a key member of the public who attended one of our meetings. We don't know who that is, and that person was not inclined to trust us. After that person was at this meeting, we got feedback that you guys, I see what you're doing, we trust you. And a larger scale, I think the larger public needs to know, wow, these guys have made some progress, they've answered all these questions, and they've done all these interviews. I think there's some value in that.
I agree with you,
Independent
Cam, that
whether
we
it's-
overmeet.
I'm sorry, Carl, go ahead.
Yeah, I
And then-
I sort of have two
Carl,
other
then-
There has to
things,
be a
yeah.
purpose.
One is, I think, one of the things we will learn is whether we are anticipating and responding to the information and concerns that are in the public, and whether we have missed things or miscalculated. So, that is a feedback mechanism that might lead us to make some corrections. Oh, we didn't pay enough attention to this issue, which a lot of people raised.
Yep.
Or we
Yeah.
came to this, we're coming to this conclusion, but people have raised some doubts about it. So it's a self-correction mechanism if we've overlooked stuff or haven't prioritized. That doesn't mean we're necessarily gonna give more weight to that. If we have contrary expert opinion that
Or
we
we
have
can
confidence
advertise it
in.
as, come give us
Right.
feedback.
The other thing is, I think what the format of the meeting is, we don't really know yet. I mean, the 4 work groups
Yeah.
is one possibility, but we might have done more integration and have more thinking.
Yeah.
We may want a different type of conversation. So I don't think that we'll know what the best format for the meeting is until we're further.
Okay, a couple more comments and we'll move on.
How about you?
Pam,
I'm still there.
two Pams. You
Would-
wanna go
Can I
first?
go first?
Yeah.
So I think that your focus should be on the 3 scenarios, not on the 4 work groups. And that one of the things you want to get in this meeting is have people have an understanding of what might happen at this site if the town doesn't take it. So that people get this sense of where they have control and where they don't when they're making their decisions later. So, for instance, what you said about, well, nobody's gonna build a few little houses, they're gonna build a massive housing unit there. If we have a private developer work there, take that site. And we don't rise up and take what we want out of it, that's something that they need to know right now, that, other towns have experienced this, where if they didn't take the site, then they did end up with uses there that they
Yeah.
didn't like. So working at it from that, and then getting the outrage about, no, I don't want the giant developer coming in and building a lot of houses there now out of the way, and not after we've made a decision and they've said, no, we don't want the town to touch it.
Okay, last comment, then I'll wrap up.
There's a couple of comments.
Go
One
ahead.
is because of your comment. I think that's sounding like pre-deciding and advocating. And that if the meeting is before we've made a decision, and if the meeting is designed in part to perhaps adjust our thinking, that to me sounds like decisional advocating. We have a decision, we want you to buy in, and I don't think that would be an appropriate thing to do, or to even to be using as our main objective or design in a situation that predates our final decision, and may be including, and may be asking the public to having us tell the public that we're actually listening to it in part before we decide. So I think that's a very dicey thing to do. With respect to my real question before Pam's was that, is the town gonna decide on acquisition at town meeting? Is that gonna, if we recommend acquisition, will the select board decide, or
That's
will
up-
the town
well-
decide? Because
There's two questions. What happens after this, if the select board decides, yes, we want to move forward, will they have to bring a warrant article? I think I'm hearing the answer is yes. Will when will that be? It doesn't have to be the following town meeting, because they can say,
Yeah.
we wanna
Okay,
wait on
but
it. So
that's what I
at
thought
At
too.
some point, I imagine we'll have to report.
Yeah,
before the
that's
town.
what I thought as well, but if not, or if we are unclear about that, then it becomes a question, is part of our objective actually to try to get the town to buy into something that we are advising they should buy into, and if the
Not a
town is not.
specific
part-
decision, but the process so that they trust it to minimize to maximize the ability of the town to make a decision on it, as opposed to being all over the place because we weren't let in and we didn't know and all of that sort of stuff. Yes, I see this all as relationship building, not just for us and the acceptance of our report, but ultimately how the town decides to handle this.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah,
It's a
yeah,
step
that's
in
helpful.
that.
Yeah, the more,
that's
the
helpful.
more we engage with the public, I think down the road it'll be easier to gain acceptance, whether it's town meeting or, by the way, I'm gonna rely on Mina's, because the warrant article is written. Article, the 2015 article is written that there had to be a hearing, not town meeting. But, you know, I've asked Mina about that, and he said it depends on whether, depends on the acquisition method. It says eminent domain. If we do something different, it may trigger a town meeting, but I'm gonna rely on Mina to.
Yeah,
There'll be a lot of political fuss one way or the other, and the better the relationship going into all of that, that we
Yeah,
can
so-
build foundations for, the better for the town.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's helpful, so it doesn't really matter.
It will matter some because town meeting has its own dynamics, but there'll be a political fuss and the better the relationship going all the way through, the better for the town.
So let me just finish this segment. So this is really good discussion. We haven't decided yet. We probably have to decide if we're gonna do this early May, maybe a month in advance of what we're planning. So we got time to kick this around. I do think we have a lot of interesting things to say.
Yeah.
And the town, I think the public should be interested not only in the reuse, but in the risk, what it's gonna cost, and how we're gonna acquire the site. And is there any upfront I mean, some of those things we may be able to disclose, we may not. But I think, you know, there's interest in what's it gonna cost. There's also interest in, obviously, in risk.
Yeah.
And there's interest in what if we don't acquire the site? You know, there's a lot of interest beyond just the reuse, but that's an important component of it. So we have time to kick this around, but this is a good discussion. I want to open this up. I do want to just very quickly, before I ask for Terry and others for public comment, so this Thursday, several of us in the legal work stream and I and Chris and Megan, I think Terry Ackerman are gonna be meeting with EPA and DOJ. We're gonna meet with Kara and two attorneys, one from EPA and DOJ. The central focus of that is to get more clarity, granularity on the lien, the federal lien, and what the government is thinking in terms of how that would be released, and we posed some other questions related to that. There are also some other topics that we wanted to discuss. I'll circulate those questions, but the meeting is, we've discussed that for a while. I think it's an information exchange. Mina will be there, but it's not a negotiation, that happens later, but I think I view this as what some things the task force needs to understand in order to make a recommendation to put in the report. I can't just say the lien could be forgiven. I have to kind of give it, you know, the circumstance, because it's $23 million.
Yeah, the big button on this is everybody in town is worried about the money. And what's
Yeah.
this cost? So this is a very important
I mean,
starting place for
For
that
me, that's,
conversation.
I mean, okay, so that's what's happening there. The upcoming meeting schedule, please take a look at that. We have two other meetings in March, but I laid out some meetings in April. What's in that schedule also is a potential briefing of the public and potential briefing of the select board. I did not clear this with the select board calendar. I don't have the select board calendar that far in advance. I haven't talked to Terry about it, but I think we owe the select board a briefing. So I put that on our meeting schedule here in addition to some other things. So maybe give me feedback on timing or.
Or just send you a note or.
Yes, send me a note, or any of those dates you can make. You already told me there are a couple of
Gordon
things.
and I already told you those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One aspect that I did want to have a possible executive session to discuss the legal matters in March 26th, but you're not going to be
Gordon
there.
and I will be not there.
Okay, so we'll maybe push that to the next
You
meeting.
mentioned April 9th, which would be
Right, and I gotta clear that with Nina and other things, so that's sort of the calendar taking us through the point, and I put July 2nd. Initial recommendations, so this is the integration period that we talked about. So I think we have to meet regularly and plan these, the agenda, so we kind of figure out how to integrate. And I'll have some suggestions how to do that, but just take a look at the schedule, give me some feedback on that.
Thank you for that, by the way, it's very helpful.
Yeah.
Wish you could throw in a couple of morning meetings, but.
Yeah, we are banned from more, I know you like the more, I don't know how to do the morning meetings, anybody in favor of
Work for
returning?
me
to
very well.
Gary,
They don't
could,
work for me, but.
yeah,
We were doing sort of every other, which I thought was a very nice touch.
yeah, that didn't last very long for some reason.
I don't know why.
I don't know. Just one of the upcoming meetings, I do want to start, not only continue this conversation about the public meeting, but start talking about criteria. I'm just thinking, how are we going to decide? What are the criteria that relates to all these things? Or what are the stopping points? How are we gonna make a decision on what a recommendation is gonna be? What are the criteria? What are the financial, the legal?
So that'll be
Uh,
something is for future agenda item, not.
Yeah, a future agenda item. So, because I think when we vote on something, we're gonna have some, we ought to agree on what the criteria for a recommendation, positive or negative. So I'm gonna put that on the agenda so we can kind of have an open discussion. So think about, what your how would you,
Won't the criteria depend on the nature of the decision? What
Yeah, I
we're
think we need to
recommending, I mean,
well,
it seems a little abstract to,
well, we're
Talk about
we're
criteria.
either
I mean-
recommending to acquire.
right,
Or
you're
not.
talking about the
And
the criteria
I'm
for
talking the
acquisition.
Yes, right. I'm talking about because that's our basic charge to make a
Right.
recommendation. There are a lot of components that go into that. So that's what I'm talking about. What are the various criteria that we're going to apply to this?
Yeah, but I wonder how much,
acquire or not?
it's both criteria, but it's also, there's sort of like a critical path, right? It seems like the first issue we have to get to is that there is a legal pathway that we're
Yeah,
comfortable
well,
with, right? I
that's
mean,
one of the criteria. Is there a
Well, it's
legal?
almost
Well,
not
but I
the
thought,
criteria, it's
I mean,
more.
again,
of a-
we're getting into the discussion, but I thought a long time ago, we decided we weren't gonna make a specific recommendation to acquire or not to acquire, but rather we were gonna say, under this set of circumstances, the select board could consider acquiring under this set of circumstances.
I don't see how you could do it any other way.
Right, so why do we need to make a recommendation to acquire or not to acquire? We're not going to. We're gonna list the circumstances under which.
I don't think that's what the select board wants a
I
recommendation, whether
think
to
the
acquire
charge
this site or not.
implies to me that they want
That's our charge.
it's in the
I'll just
charge.
put- I think we're saying about the same thing. If, say, we would make a recommendation to acquire if blank under these circumstances. Or, anyway, this is what I'm talking about. We have to look at the charge again, but I think that is, and then Terry just went live on here, so she can reinforce what you're looking for, but I think it's a recommendation whether to acquire or not, and if not, there are other, where that leaves the town on the site. So at that perfect time to open it up for select board and other public comment. Terry? Anything?
Thank you, Paul. Good meeting, everybody. I have 3 comments. First of all, I really like the idea of having another public forum. I think you're making a lot of progress and it's very important to get the buy-in from the citizens. And one way you can get more attendance of the most interested citizens is to invite the committees that you've been working with, or any committee that has anything to do with those slides. For example, all the housing groups, the DPW, the recreation, the solar task force. These people are going to want to show up and see what you're thinking. And if you add up all those people, that could be 100 people right there. So, and then those are the people who care, who are paying attention, who are going to make waves if they don't think they were included. So, if you can find a way to invite them, staff can help, whatever, Another comment I have is, I was at the meeting this morning remotely, And two things struck me. First of all, I'm really not clear on the cap design, the new cap design, and I think I had to leave right about when they were getting to it because it was after 11:30 and I had to go to another meeting. I think it's really important to make sure that the oversight committee is really, really comfortable with the new design before, before we recommend anything with this committee. Because it's different. They've made this huge change. With it, it was 10 feet, now it's 2 feet. I think we really gotta make sure the oversight committee is completely comfortable with that kind of major change. And then my final comment, another thing that happened this morning, Bruce said the final product will have some safe areas and some contaminated areas. Well, I think it's going to be super important to get a really, really clear handle on, how many areas are we talking about? What are all the ICs, institutional controls, going to be? How many different areas are going to be, quote, unsafe, and how is this all going to work? So those are my comments. I see
Yeah,
Carrie.
thank you.
Yeah.
On the cap design, there's a good graphic. I agree that I think the oversight committee has to be comfortable. There was a discussion of that. There's a new cap design. It has, I think, 4 feet of soil over an impermeable membrane. So I think they've been somewhat responsive to the criticisms, and I think they've improved. I don't think they have a final design yet, so I think that's better, but in progress. As far as leaving contaminated, I don't recall that. I mean, the holding basin will be sequestered, but everything else is going to be cleaned up to residential standards. So there's no contamination left unless it's deep or in the holding basin.
You may be
but
thinking that.
Sorry, I thought also that the holding basin would be the only contaminated area. But I heard Bruce clearly say today, something a little bit different. That was going to be, he used the word safe and unsafe. And so I think we need to get a handle on that.
Yeah.
I think he was saying safe to dig.
Yeah.
He was talking about if you were to put a foundation in, a piling in or a foundation in that went more than 10 feet deep, there would be places where that was safe and that you could dig, and there would be places where you had to work to have a health and safety plan while you were doing that to ensure that it was safe.
He was not saying it was unsafe. He said you had to have a plan approved in advance to do it.
Yeah,
There'll be a map of all those areas as part of the institutional controls. If you want to dig, it's like a dig safe thing. If you want to dig here below 10 feet, this is an area where you have to get all the extra stuff.
Yeah,
And you
make
have to
sure
do extra
there's no cable
remediation.
there you're
So
gonna cut.
That was my understanding.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I
And
heard.
Yeah.
it is very much so that means that that's a location where it would cost more to put in a foundation or a
Mhm.
footing that went deeper than 10 feet.
Yeah, so, yeah, I mean, strictly speaking, there will be some contamination left at depth. But still, if that area is subject to the ICs, but still could be excavated if a health and safety plan and at the town's expense or at the owner's expense, it could be used. And you'd have to dispose of that contaminated soil safely and appropriately. So, yeah. Hope that helps. Thank you for your comments, especially on the public meeting, I think. Just before you leave, our chart, we had this discussion here at the end here on recommendation. My understanding that the select board needs a recommendation whether or not to acquire the site. And, there's something like that. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah, I think, I like the idea of putting it on your agenda. There are sort of two ways to look at it. One is, are you gonna make one recommendation if this, and this? Or are you gonna do it the way I think Gary was saying, is sort of a different way of, if this, then we recommend this. If this, then we recommend this. I mean, there's different ways that you can approach it. So I think it needs a discussion at
Yeah.
at your,
They sound fairly similar, but maybe it's late in the evening and I'm missing it, so.
I can just ask a question of Terry too, the idea of other options that we didn't consider, or things that, you know, maybe you should consider that we're not in the boundary conditions of the charge. I think that it might be useful to have in our report things that maybe should be considered with respect to use of that site, in addition to acquisition or non-acquisition. I just wondered what you thought about that.
like what?
What
Like-
is there besides?
Buying or part of the site, let's say, or with the state, or wait for, I don't necessarily think we should do any of these things, but, or zone, I mean, you know, things that are not quite as binary, shall we say, as those two thought, of yes or no, but, you know, here are the
Yeah.
things that the town should consider.
Right. So I think, yes, you should consider all of those things. And at some point, I think I heard from somebody, Mina or somebody, that it might not be financially feasible to, or EPA might not want us to split it that way. But you should consider all those options, and the ones you reject, just write a paragraph like, well, we considered it, but we can't do it, or we don't recommend it because X, Y, Z. Because for
Yeah, but-
sure, the public is gonna ask those questions. So the select board won't remember the answer, but there it is in the report, great, you know, that would be really helpful.
To your non-binary, I think we discussed one of the non-binary, whether the town could, with mass development, for example, in some kind of partnership. So that's sort of
Yeah,
a,
that kind of-
that's a non,
or-
but I think acquiring part of the site is off the table.
I think,
That's-
yeah,
that's
the
very true.
EPA says it's off the table. It may be very wise to have it be off the table. It's not legally off the table, and it may, who knows, you know, it's just I'm not suggesting that it's something we might want to consider. I just think it is the policy of the EPA, I gather, not to do a partial acquisition, but I think it may be possible to do it if you wanted to push it.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying we should.
Maybe we should ask them on Thursday.
And I don't think, well, I think you should think whether you wanna even go there first, but.
You know, these are all hypotheticals, I mean, so, okay.
One
Can
more
you-
thing, Paul, we're gonna talk tomorrow. I do have the select board's calendar, so remind me. I have the calendar through May 1st.
So the select, on my schedule, I had the select board briefing, on June 10th. It's a Monday, so I don't,
Uh-huh.
the calendar's out.
We don't have it up that far yet, so, okay, okay.
I know, and you'll have a new select board member, at least one,
And a new chairman.
a new chair, yeah. So, we have some new acquaintance, so it's worthwhile just to get everybody up to speed. And, which is one reason why we can't wait too long, because in a few years, there'll be a new set of select people and,
And we'll be all in that housing that they were talking about
We'll be
building
there.
there.
Okay.
Apologies.
When the town finally gets its act together.
Okay, with that, I'm going to adjourn. Thank you very much, everybody.
All in favor of adjournment, leave the room.
See you tomorrow, Terry.